I trusted the experts and ignored the voice that tried to save me. The sentence sat in Victor Blackwell's mind like a verdict, simple and terrible. Behind the curtain of his hospital suite, the monitors kept time with small insistence. A flat line of numbers punctuated by the occasional frantic spike. Machines that had been purchased at lavish prices hummed and beeped, translating the body's chaos into charts and colors he no longer understood. Men and women in crisp white coats came and went, their voices clipped with authority and procedure. They conferred in clusters, fingers tapping screens and pens, mouths shaping medical nouns like liturgy. He had believed them. He had trusted that their degrees would make sense of the stubborn, spreading failure inside him. But there had been a voice others did not notice. A soft, observant presence moving through the same corridors without title or fanfare. Angela Bowmont had been hired to keep the rooms immaculate, to replace trash bags and fold the hospital gowns into anonymous neatness. She swept, wiped, and replenished, an unseen constancy at the edges of the institution's glare. Where white coats tore a patient's life into diagnoses, Angela's eyes threaded the small living details. The way a fingernail hinted at a poison, the pattern of hair left in a pillow, the smell clinging to a visitor's sleeve. She had been a chemistry prodigy once, a student whose scholarship had promised laboratories and discovery. Life had rearranged that promise into double shifts and night carts. Her hands still remembered the shapes of beakers and the hum of Bunsen burners. But those memories lived beneath a uniform and the invisible labor that kept other people's worlds clean. That night, the suite in Meridian General's private wing felt like a wound. Victor's skin had a sheen that the nurses tried to conceal with cool towels. His speech came in fragments. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, slid in different directions as if trying to focus on multiple things at once. The attending team, led by Dr. Thaddeus Reynolds, a man whose hair was the same precise gray as his cufflinks, assembled daily under the clinical fluorescent lights, each entry of their footsteps measured and deliberate. They had called in neurology, infectious disease, rheumatology. They had scanned and biopsied again. They checked liver panels and renal output, crossed off autoimmune markers and viral serologies. Time, the specialists agreed, was dissolving before their eyes. "You show the ascending neuropathy," Dr. Reynolds said when he traced the timeline aloud, his voice a baritone that made the nurses tidy their notes. "But the pattern isn't classic, could be perineoplastic, could be a toxic metabolic process. I'm ordering a full heavy metal panel. We'll run chelation if needed." Angela heard the words and tilted the trash bin, listening. She had kept to the margins during the rounds, working around the team, tucking tissues away, replacing the soap dispenser. Her uniform smelled faintly of lemon-scented sanitizer and the iron tang of the hospital's water. When doctors spoke of heavy metals, her pulse thinned with a strange, private hope. She had seen the textbook images in a campus lab years before. Nails that darkened from inside like somebody had drawn a shadow beneath the cuticle. Hair that fell as if cut at the root. Stomachs with the slow burn of metal. She had seen them not as an academic curiosity but as a closed door to a life she had once believed she was going to open. The hand cream went unnoticed by every white coat in the room. It was small and imported, the kind of luxury his visitors favored. A pearly jar with a foreign script, a faint floral scent that clung to fingers. In practice, the things brought into the room were as important as the tests ordered, and yet they drifted past the professionals like props. Jefferson Burke, who visited Victor with the cordial smile of a man who knew power, set the jar on the bedside table as if it belonged there. He wiped his hands once on his suit, tucked the handkerchief back into his breast pocket, and then sat where the light hit his jaw most effectively. He talked about corporate reports and board meetings. He wore the casual confidence of someone who made deals in private rooms and walked away with profits. Angela noticed the jar because she had to move it almost every time she changed the linen. She noticed the tiny particles of cream clinging to its lid, a slightly greasy fingerprint that would leave a trace on anyone who used it more than once. When she changed the pillow beneath Victor's head later, her fingers brushed a flake of powder that had fallen near the seam. An insignificant thing to most people. To her, it read like a loose sentence in a book she had already half memorized. She had reasons to stay invisible. There were Marcus and Tasha waiting at an apartment across town, dinners to be warmed in a small oven, school projects to cajole through with whispered encouragements. There was the rent that climbed every month like a shadow across the ledger of her life. She could not admit to friends that she still wondered about the scholarship she had let slip, about the experiment she had not been allowed to finish when a family emergency pulled her home. Nobody in the hospital knew that beneath Angela's broom and disinfectant, a certain portion of her mind still worked like a lab. She organized possibilities and exclusions the way she arranged the linen cart, methodically, without drama. The first week had been a litany of narrow hypotheses. The specialists tried antibiotics against an assumed occult infection, then steroids against supposed autoimmune inflammation. Each intervention bought a little time but changed nothing essential. Victor's kidneys began to falter, then regressed in fits and starts. His peripheral neuropathy knotted into weakness that made the simplest activities an effort. At one point, a neurologist whispered, Guillain-Barré? And a roomful of people folded over that possibility like a map being consulted. Papers were pulled, consent forms crossed with pens. The family listened and nodded because that was what families did when professionals spoke. Angela watched all of this and cataloged what none of them were mentioning. She thought of the way his nails had taken on a steely line near the base, a bluish staining beneath the surface. She remembered the hair she had found on his pillow, stubbled and brittle as if torn from the root. She thought of the particular abdominal complaints, sharp pain that came in waves rather than steady nods. The combination prickled her memory like an old chemical burn, a heavy metal with a particular cruelty, one that moved quietly and without flair. Thallium. The word arose in her mind with the same clarity it had when she used to read journals at the university stacks. But Angela did not say it, not at first. Her role had no currency in a conference room. A housekeeper's observation was easy to set aside, sentimental, prone to error, unscientific. She understood the institutional logic. She had built a practical respect for it because it protected people within the hierarchy. Doctors spoke, others followed. If she presented something without evidence, she would be laughed away. If she pressed and was wrong, she risked her job and the tiny security it provided her children. The institutional machinery made humility a survival strategy. Still, she began to build the scaffolding of an argument in the only way she could. She watched Jefferson Burke leave the room unhurriedly one evening, his hand lingering for a moment on the jar before he slipped it into a leather bag. She remembered the precise cadence of his visits, always in the late afternoon, always after the market closed. She took to staying an extra 10 minutes after the others left, using the low light in the corridors to check the visitor registry on a desktop at the staff lounge while pretending to make coffee. The log saved small signatures and times. It did not register the quiet, habitual things that indicated intent, but it would do as a framework. On a Wednesday, with an efficiency team replacing bedding, Angela found a smear of cream inside a sleeve that had been brushed against the handrail. Her palms tightened. There were no cameras at the exact corner where she crouched, only the dull hum of HVAC and the distant whine of an elevator. She took a scrap of tissue and folded it in her pocket. No one stopped her. Being invisible meant she could take risks others wouldn't think to take. It also meant her small rebellions were easily hidden by the ordinary noise of the hospital. Days telescoped into an investigative rhythm. She cross-checked visitor times against episodes of symptom escalation. She interviewed a night nurse who admitted, embarrassed, that she had noticed the hair loss, but dismissed it as chemotherapy effects, because earlier records hinted at an unrelated cancer history. A nursing assistant remembered seeing Burke linger by the dispensary one night, asking for a brand of imported cream he claimed helped his hands. Small testimonies aggregated into a pattern that made Angela's gut tighten until it was almost a fist. Her makeshift testing took place in a maintenance closet that smelled of lemon oil and old paint. She closed the door and laid the tissue on the stainless worktop, moving with practiced care. She had not the license to run assays, but she had a mind that could interpret colors and precipitates, a sensibility fine-tuned by years in a lab before life pulled her away. She used a reagent strip that nurses kept for pH checks, nothing exotic, nothing that an internet search would mistake for chemistry class. But she also relied on an old trick she had learned in an undergraduate lab. A color response could be suggestive, not definitive. The tissue reacted. The strip showed a change that, in combination with the other signs she had collected, pushed the possibility from the realm of hope into the territory of urgent hypothesis. She did not publish the result. She translated it into the language those in power would understand. She photocopied time-stamped entries from the visitor log, annotated them with the day's medications, and taped a small sequence of notes to a manila envelope. She scribbled the dates Marcus had texted to say he needed his math book signed, the times Tasha would be out rehearsing for choir, things that grounded this work in the reality that she had to return home each night. She labeled the envelope, Burke Visits, Correlation to Symptoms. It was ugly and hand-scrawled, but it was a narrative in a place where narratives mattered. When she first raised her concerns to a floor manager, the response was a professional, well-meaning pat on the arm. "If you have serious concerns, we have protocols," the manager said. "But these things can make people nervous. We don't want to alarm the family," Angela answered with the quiet steadiness she had learned in the night shifts. "I'm not trying to alarm anybody. I just want the doctors to look at the cream. Please." The manager took the envelope, thumbed through the photocopies, and promised to bring it to the attending. Later, Angela learned that the envelope had been placed on a shelf behind other documents and, at some point, misfiled. The institution's appetite for official channels had a bureaucratic hunger. It could swallow urgent observations whole and add them to the pile. The case pivoted one Thursday morning when Victor, who had been lucid the night before, failed to recognize the nurse who came to adjust his lines. He pressed his palms to the mattress and whispered fragments of sentences, as if trying to hold on to a thread that was slipping from his memory. The interns ran tests that showed a small but worrying decline in renal function. The room filled with quiet alarms and the soft shuffle of shoes. Dr. Reynolds convened a conference of specialists in room 7B, just across the hall from the private suite, their papers arranged like weapons in a war council. Angela could have kept to the periphery, continued her quiet collation of evidence, and waited for the formal heavy metal panel to return. But watching Victor fail a little more every hour, watching the white-coated procession nod at hypotheses that skimmed the surface without diving, wounded something in her that had nothing to do with pay. It was a moral friction that could not be polished away by a rag or a smile. She thought of Marcus's little hands, of Tasha's habit of humming before she slept. She thought of the professor who had once told her that the best science was sometimes the least glamorous. Patience, observation, humility. If no one else would see what she had started to see, she told herself, then she would have to make them. She borrowed pages from a supply closet shredder and used its jammed edge to rip neat strips from a magazine, turning them into makeshift index tabs. She labeled each with times and notes and then taped the tissue sample into the center. It felt like a prayer offered in a broom closet, small, private, and defiantly human. The act of organizing her observations into something legible to others, to the people who commanded rooms and reputations, gave Angela a momentum she had not expected. The hospital's hierarchy was not mean. It was practical, protective of itself because it had to be. Dr. Reynolds was an expert who carried decades of cases inside him like a ledger. His pride was only partly ego. It was also a commitment to the arc of medicine. Measure, hypothesize, test, repeat. He had saved lives before, and Angela had seen his hands steady on ventilators, watched him bring clarity in chaos. That knowledge made her dread the moment his gaze would skim past things that did not fit his pattern, like an editor folding down a paragraph that strayed from the script. Outside, Jefferson Burke stepped from his car with the practiced ease of a man who had never known a night of worry over rent. He carried a briefcase and the same imported cream jar, which he had brought 3 times in the last week. He smiled at a staff member with the sort of polite warmth that could melt a security guard's suspicion. He arrived on time, as always, and Angela watched as he positioned himself in the corner of the suite, primed like a player in a theater he had chosen. He brought flowers one afternoon, a gesture that softened the edges of his presence and made his jar of cream look like a gentleness, rather than a possible instrument. The first soft crescendo came when a young resident, Dr. Park, pressed a stethoscope against Victor's chest and frowned. "This isn't fitting neatly anywhere," she told Dr. Reynolds. "We could keep chasing autoimmune markers, but the timeline seems off. He had a good baseline a month ago." Her words were cautious, offering an opening that acknowledged complexity. Dr. Reynolds, unruffled, answered in that measured tone that belonged to those who'd seen too many false dawns. "We proceed with the heavy metal panel. Until we have results, we avoid changing course on anecdotal correlation." A piece of Angela's confidence faltered at the word anecdotal. To most, the cream was a scent and a vanity. To her, it was a node of causality. She could have left it at that. The heavy metal panel would return, a formal result would come back, and the institution would act. But the timeline of lab work did not match the rhythm of Victor's decline. While tests processed, hours multiplying into a day, Victor would fray further. She could not abide waiting. She made herself into a shape that could not be ignored. The next time Burke visited, Angela timed the movement of his hands with a precision that felt new and necessary. When he rose to fetch coffee in the corridor, she followed with no pretense of purpose. In the bustling cafeteria, she watched as he turned his wrist to check his watch, wiping it almost casually against his palm. Later, in a moment of routine, she lifted the jar from the bedside table and placed it in her cart, under a pile of clean towels. The theft was minor by any legal definition. It was also the theft of a person who had been told she possessed no authority. She tucked the jar in her bag and wheeled the cart into a stairwell that smelled of fresh paint and iron. The jar was warm from hands that had held it. What Angela did next was guided by an ethics that was not written in hospital protocol. She performed a field test that she described later, with a single qualifier. It was suggestive, not conclusive. She used common, non-destructive materials from the supply closet and a colorimetric rule of thumb she had learned long ago. The cream reacted in a way that made her throat close with relief and terror at once. It was a small color change, almost a whisper, but she knew the whisper's dialect well enough to hear danger. She left the stairwell with the jar neatly wrapped in a towel and her chest tight. On the service elevator, she watched her reflection in the metal wall. A woman in scrubs and sensible shoes, bags under her eyes, hair tucked into a cap, carrying the thing that might be a key. For a brief, fragile moment, she imagined how it would feel to be believed. To watch a conference room hush at the sound of someone so low in the chain, and then to observe the tide of respect turn. She imagined the ledger of her life rewriting itself. Tuition covered, nights on her feet replaced by a bench in a lab, Marcus and Tasha watching as their mother stood not just as a caregiver, but as a scientist again. Back in the room, the monitors climbed and fell. Victor stirred in the way of someone trying to catch a conversation midstream. Nurses fussed, and a resident called for a medication review. Angela sat the jar on a shelf in the utility closet and opened her phone to write a neat, honest message. Heavy metal suspicion. Thallium. Correlates with Burke's visits. See notes. She meant to send it to Dr. Park because the younger physician had the week before shown a willingness to consider out-of-hierarchy input. Before she hit send, her fingers hovered. She thought of how many times she had been dismissed. She thought of the comfortable certainty of the experts and the fragile thread of a man's life that was fraying. She did not send the message. That night she carried the jar back into the room on the pretense of organizing the bedside table. Burke, who had an uncanny sense for presentation, commented on the neatness with a smile that unveiled nothing. She smiled back and placed the jar on a shelf far from the bed. Her plan was not yet feral enough to risk a confrontation without evidence. When she finally walked into the conference room on Friday afternoon, she did so with the slow resolve of someone who knows what it costs to go unheard. The room was full of people whose reputations lived off ordered thought. Doctors in tailored scrubs, a hospital administrator with a tie like a penance, several consultants who had flown in for a second opinion. Dr. Reynolds held court at the head of the table. The case file lay before each specialist like an offering. Angela had rehearsed nothing aloud. Instead, she had a stack of photocopies, a strip of tissue wrapped inside a paper towel, and her own voice, which had learned to be soft and precise. She had every reason to be afraid. To interrupt a closed clinical conference could mean termination. It could mean humiliation. It could mean being escorted off the premises with more dignity than the truth sometimes demanded. But fear was a small coin next to the possibility of a man dying, because the system preferred comfortable patterns over inconvenient observation. She opened the door and felt the room tilt toward her. Heads turned with a quick professional reflex, and for a second the air smelled like antiseptic and possibility. Dr. Reynolds' eyebrows rose in a way that registered apology before he supplied it. "This isn't a public forum," he began, the sentence engineered to displace her gently. Angela held up the envelope. The paper crinkled like a heartbeat beneath her fingers. "I know," she said, "but I have something you should see." The words were small, neither pleading nor grand. They were simply what she had to say. A silence fell that was not curious but calculating, one trained to weigh evidence from credentialed sources. Angela stepped forward, a housekeeper with a hypothesis. In that moment the room divided into two kinds of people, those who counted hands and titles and those who could not yet decide whether to count the smell of a cream as a clue. The first tended to the hedges of protocol, the second, Dr. Park among them, tilted like grass in the wind, ready to move if compelled. She did not yet reveal everything. She drew a line through the center of her argument and held it there, offering only enough to force attention. A photocopied log aligning Burke's visits to symptom spikes, a note from a nurse about hair loss, a small, wrapped tissue that had returned a suggestive color change. The envelope felt fragile in the room that valued thick dossiers and peer-reviewed papers, but fragility, she had learned, could be proof enough when someone finally opened their eyes. A murmur began at the edges of the table. Dr. Reynolds unfolded his hands and looked not at her uniform but at the evidence. The air shifted, as if a dam were starting to strain. A murmur began at the edges of the table, a susurration that loosened the tight weave of authority for the first time. Dr. Reynolds unfolded his hands and, without grand gesture, leaned forward to look at the photocopied log. Dr. Park reached for the wrapped tissue as if it were fragile but necessary evidence. The room that had rehearsed so many certainties now listened to a woman who had nothing to sell but a story and a scrap of paper. "This is—" Dr. Reynolds started, then stopped because the shape of the claim didn't fit the cadence he used for lab-verified facts. He was careful. His care had saved people before. It had earned him a quiet deference that made hospitals run on predictability. He was also a man who knew the weight of being wrong. "We need a targeted assay," he said finally. His voice had the soft landing of someone setting a course change rather than trumpeting condemnation. Angela felt the world narrow to the table and the small stack of scraps in her hand. The relief that rose was almost physical. A hollow opening in her chest she feared might close if the room shifted again. Dr. Park, quieter than the attending but with an urgency that had become her signature, looked at Angela and said, "Thank you. Would you mind stepping out with me for a moment?" She gestured with the thin formality of a professional inviting a witness to witness something else. Validation. Outside the room, Dr. Park closed the door and rewound the facts in a voice low enough that only Angela could hear. "I'm asking the lab to prioritize a heavy metal panel and a targeted thallium assay. It'll take time, but I'll put in the contiguity order for immediate testing. I can't promise anything, but I'll put my name on it." There was an earnestness in the young doctor's face that Angela recognized as a thing akin to courage, an index of willingness to be wrong for the sake of truth. Angela nodded, throat tight. "That's all I want," she said. "For someone to look, for Victor to have a chance." The lab moved with its own slowness, efficient, methodical, not designed for drama. Still, Dr. Park's call bumped their cue. Blood draws were expedited, samples couriered, and a targeted thallium assay was requested with a notation that read like a plea. For the first time in days, Angela watched people rearrange their obligations around an inked request that had come out of the mouth of someone whose badge hung in a different corner of the hospital. Over the next 24 hours, the hospital oscillated between hope and guarded caution. Procedures shifted. A room that had been thickened with quiet despair lightened into a place of taut attention. Victor's monitors still whispered their own language, but now there were small, hopeful shifts, an increased urine output, a less labored breath. These were measured in numbers and tasks, rather than declarations, each nurse's charted note a promise that science could be redirected. When the targeted assay returned, the result arrived not with a trumpet but with the thin, clinical clarity of a lab report. Measurable thallium levels above the expected range. It was not a certainty about source or intent, only evidence that confirmed the possibility Angela had been afraid to speak aloud. Dr. Reynolds read the line and, like a man reading the final line of an old argument, exhaled. The correction that followed was immediate and practical. Consultation shifted toward toxicology. Antidotal therapy appropriate for thallium exposure was discussed in tones of careful hope. The team that had been working in concentric theories now assembled around a single, actionable course. Protocols were invoked and then, gently, augmented by the kind of common sense Angela had been translating into scraps. "How did we miss this?" one of the consultants asked later, in a voice that did not seek absolution so much as understanding. The question hung between apology and an attempt to armor the institution against the knowledge of its own fallibility. Dr. Park answered with a short, direct sentence. "We followed the tracks we were trained to follow. Sometimes those tracks don't take us to where the clue is hidden." Recognition arrived in ways that were both public and private. Nurses who had earlier shrugged at the hair on a pillow now approached Angela with contrition, offering small explanations and larger ones. Overwork, the fog of rotation, the comfort of routine. The floor manager who had promised to pass on Angela's envelope found her in the hallway and, voice-catching, said, "I should have pushed harder. I'm sorry." That apology mattered more than any accolade, because it acknowledged a human mistake rather than insisting on institutional infallibility. For Victor, the change was less dramatic than movies might suggest. Thallium, when it's caught in time, is stubborn, but not inexorable. He received supportive care, fluids to help excrete toxins, medications to protect organs, and a course of Prussian blue to bind what the body could not otherwise eject as efficiently. The effect was not immediate resurrection. It was a slow reordering of chemistry toward equilibrium. Over the next several days, nurses charted incremental improvements, less nausea, small gains in cognition, fingers regaining some warmth. He remained fragile. He remained very much alive. At his bedside, Angela hovered more than she cleaned. Her presence was a new kind of labor, one that did not bend linens but steadied a man whose mind kept slipping. When she sat, she listened to the small rhythms of his respiration, and when he was lucid enough to speak, she found that the first words that came to his lips were not about boards or money, but about the sensation of being invisible. Weeks earlier, as he lay drifting between delirium and lucidity, Victor had believed in authority with a faith that was less ideological than practical. Expertise had been the engine that powered a life of decisions and success. To him, degrees were a kind of grammar for the world, structures that translated uncertainty into manageable steps. When Angela interrupted the grammar, and when the lab confirmed her suspicion, the realization that he had been endangered by an institutional blindness docked him in a new place of shame and gratitude that were not easily reconciled. He learned her name, Angela Bowmont, through gentle introductions, and the way the syllables formed in his mouth was full of something like astonishment. He had not expected the person who cared for towel corners to be the person who would save his life. On a morning when his words returned with more steadiness, he managed, almost embarrassed, "I trusted the experts." Angela, who had spent entire nights rehearsing the work of being small and invisible, did not accept his flinch toward self-reproach. She told him simply, "You did what anyone in your place would do. You trusted the people around you." When the FBI opened an inquiry, it did so with a procedural gravity that made the hospital corridors feel narrower and more official. Agent Ramirez introduced herself with a card and a measured gaze. She asked questions that circled around motive and means without presupposing guilt. For the FBI, the science was a lead to follow. Thallium present in Mr. Blackwell's system, an external source suggested by the cream, a series of visits by Jefferson Burke temporally aligned with symptom escalation. The case moved from hospital conference room to chain of custody protocols, to sealed evidence and recorded interviews. Angela's involvement in the investigation was delicate. The hospital, mindful of liability and public image, insisted that her role be formalized through an internal review first. It was both protection for her and a bureaucratic pause that made her anxiety knot. Dr. Matthews, the hospital administrator, negotiated the terms with a tact that kept the case under control while acknowledging the seriousness of what had occurred. The administration allowed Angela leave to assist the investigators, acknowledging that her observations had been crucial to discovering the toxin that had endangered a patient. She met agents in an interview room lined with corkboards and gently explained what she had seen and done. Her testimony was clean and matter-of-fact, the product of nights of precise observation and days of careful note-taking. While investigators moved through digital footprints and payment records, the question of motive unfurled. Jefferson Burke was a man whose public life smelled of influence, board seats, private investments, a reputation for making things happen. For the FBI, his relationship with Victor began to look less like friendship and more like access to advantage. Through subpoenaed logs, investigators found competing filings in the tech sector, where Victor's company and a rival had been jockeying for patent control. The narrative that emerged was not cinematic in neatness. It was a collage of emails, a hurried wire transfer, a security camera angle that showed Burke lingering just a moment too long by the bedside when no one was watching. The legal team compiled a picture that, while not a verdict in itself, was enough for an arrest warrant. Burke was taken in quietly, not in a handcuff-laced spectacle but in a way that respected procedure and guarded against theatricality. When officers came to his door at dawn, he answered as if it were another meeting. Calm, prepared, perhaps unaccustomed to being on the other side of suspicion. His interrogation was long, his denials practiced. Motives are often messy, and the human heart resists the simplicity of villain labels. The FBI's case would later rest on a combination of motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. Traces of the imported cream that matched swabs taken from his clothing, a pattern of behavior that made him a person of interest, and financial movements that gave investigators a reason to explore corporate espionage as one plausible explanation. Through all of this, the hospital had to stitch itself into a story that fit its own values. There were internal reviews and notes of apology issued to the family, an insistence on learning rather than scapegoating. Dr. Reynolds stood before a small group of staff one morning and spoke in a voice that had the weight of someone who had to reconcile pride and responsibility. "We are a system built on knowledge," he told them, "but knowledge is human. We will examine our processes and listen more carefully. We must do better." That promise led to pragmatic change. The hospital instituted an easier pathway for non-clinical staff to highlight concerns to the clinical team. A small digital portal allowed anyone, from a housekeeper to a delivery driver, to flag observations which would then be triaged by a designated clinician within a set time frame. Open-floor audits were scheduled where heads of departments would sit with frontline staff to hear concerns and learn the language of observation beyond their own specialties. Training modules were updated to emphasize lateral listening as a complement to vertical authority. These changes were not a panacea. They were procedural shifts, slow to implant, but they signaled that a single overlooked voice could influence institutional practice. As the hospital revised policy, it also turned its attention to Angela. The board members who had not met her before now knew her by reputation. Dr. Matthews approached her with an offer that felt to her both risky and kind. A scholarship fund to allow her to re-enter the world of formal chemistry study, time off to prepare for entrance exams, and a paid fellowship at the hospital to study toxicology from practical, on-the-floor experience. It was not just money. It was the reweaving of a life she had thought beyond repair. Angela accepted with practical gratitude. She thought of Marcus and Tasha, and of the nights when dinner had been the negotiation of small bills. She thought of the professor who had once placed a slip of encouragement in her hand, and told her she had the mind of someone who could ask the right questions of the world. The scholarship covered tuition, yes, but it also covered the dignity of being recognized not as a cautionary example, but as someone whose knowledge mattered. During the weeks of Victor's rehabilitation, he and Angela formed a careful friendship that avoided the rawness of obligation and instead settled into a mutual respect. He made small reparations, not ones to erase the past, but gestures that acknowledged responsibility. He testified to the hospital's inquiry not with grand confession, but with a measured accounting of how authority and deference had blinded him. He met Angela's children in a slow, formal dinner where he kept his tone humble and listened as the family traded stories. Marcus, who had been 12 when Angela worked nights, now watched her with a kind of pride children reserve for parents who finally allow themselves to be seen. The public face of the case remained muted. The hospital requested discretion. The family, for privacy, declined press conferences. Some details leaked, inevitably, but the larger narrative was shaped by small, intimate reckonings rather than sensational headlines. That quiet suited Angela better. Her victory was not a banner to hang so much as a door that had been reopened. Months later, in a ceremony that felt both ceremonial and overdue, the hospital honored Angela with a formal commendation and the funding for her scholarship. Dr. Park spoke on her behalf in a short, direct speech that highlighted the moral courage of listening to a voice outside the expected hierarchy. "This is not about one person being right," she said. "It's about all of us learning to listen well." At the podium, Angela found her voice without showmanship. She spoke of Marcus and Tasha, of tutors and unpaid internships, of the professor who had put a stamp of belief on a scholarship application, and then watched her life take another turn. She also spoke for the housekeepers, the maintenance staff, the radiology techs, people whose work threaded the hospital's fabric but rarely its conversation. Her words were not an indictment. They were an invitation to see. Victor's recovery was a patient thing. Therapy sessions to retrain nerve function, long walks to rebuild stamina, and an acceptance of new limitations. He returned to a life that had been tempered by the knowledge of fragility. His board meetings resumed and were different, shaded by a reluctance to assume the correct answer existed simply because someone in a suit declared it so. He used his influence quietly, arranging for a donation to the hospital's new scholarship fund in Angela's name, a gesture that left the press release careful and small. He also wrote letters to the hospital administration about the changes he thought meaningful. Better integration of non-clinical observations into clinical decision-making, more cross-disciplinary humility, and formal support for staff who flagged concerns. The FBI case moved at a pace governed by evidence, legal processes, and the due care of prosecutorial review. Burke's motives were laid out in a public indictment that avoided sensationalism. Prosecutors described a pattern of financial pressure and opportunistic access, factors arranged in a web that explained motive without collapsing it into neat villainy. The trial process was technical, humane, and not terribly theatrical. Burke's defense challenged the evidence. The prosecution argued motive and opportunity. In the end, courts did what courts do. They sifted, adjudicated, and imposed consequences commensurate with the findings. For Angela, the trial was less a spectacle, and more a day when she was called to recount things she had already lived and documented. She sat upright when asked in court about the sequence of events and, without drama, explained the odor of the cream, the hair on a pillow, the timing of visits. Her testimony did not deliver justice in and of itself. It fit into a larger mosaic of proof that a courtroom assembled with its own cautious craftsmanship. Once the legal dust had settled, life became a quieter work of reclamation. Angela's scholarship took her back to benchside work where she relearned and advanced techniques that the job market had shifted in her absence. She studied toxicology with a hunger that was steady and practical. Marcus grew taller. Tasha's choir practice led to a high school solo that Angela would never miss. The family dinners became rituals not of survival, but of flourishing. Years later, after study and internships and long nights of balancing parenthood with the demands of graduate coursework, Angela crossed a stage to receive a degree in applied chemistry. Dr. Reynolds, older but gentler than when the story began, sat in the audience and applauded not for himself but for the system that had allowed correction. He shook her hand afterward in the shadow of the auditorium lights and said simply, "You taught us what listening looks like. Thank you." Angela's career trajectory continued. She accepted a fellowship that combined toxicology research and community health outreach, a role where she could both test for hazards and teach hospital staff how to listen. She mentored students who had come from similar invisible labor backgrounds, staff who worked nights, who packed lunches for children, who had once been told to keep to the margins. She taught them to translate observation into evidence, how to keep notes, how to document times and details, how to escalate concerns in ways that institutions could receive without defensive reflex. These were not tricks, but practices of dignity. A plaque in the hospital lobby later bore the name of a small fund started in Angela's honor, the Bowmont Listening Fund. Its purpose was modest and precise: to pay for scholarships for non-traditional students working in healthcare who showed aptitude and a willingness to re-enter formal training. It funded continuing education courses, covered exam fees, and, when possible, provided stipends so that single parents could afford to take classes without sacrificing pay. The plaque did not sermonize, it simply recorded a truth. Sometimes the person who saves a life is one the system never notices at first. Victor visited the hospital one afternoon much after his illness had become part of the past rather than the present. He walked slowly down the corridor to the research wing where Angela worked, carrying a small bouquet that seemed almost quaint in his careful hands. He found her in a lab coat that fit her differently now, less like a costume of service and more like the armor of a practiced scientist. "I trusted the experts," he said when she rose to greet him, the phrase stark in the corridor light. It was not a confession so much as an admission with a complex tale. It held apology and the kind of humility that experiences of vulnerability often cultivate. Angela smiled without condescension. "You trusted people," she corrected gently. "Now you know it's everyone we should trust. The ones who see what others miss, and the ones with the training to turn that seeing into action." Victor placed his hand briefly atop hers. "I ignored the voice that tried to save me," he said in a voice flattened by memory and the soft weight of what that meant. The words landed as if he was reading from a ledger he wished he'd annotated earlier. "You hurt her eventually," Angela said. "That's what matters now. You did something with what you learned." He left a donation that would expand the fund and an additional private scholarship that paid repair wages to families who otherwise couldn't afford time off for education. It was not a grand public statement. Instead, it was the kind of private reparation that sought to lessen the chances that another invisible person would be discounted again. In the years that followed, Angela stood at many small stages. She spoke at hospital trainings and at small conferences about the humility of expertise. She emphasized not antagonism toward specialists, but an ethic of listening that included everyone along the chain of care. Her voice was not bitter. It was made of the practical clarity of someone who had been in the middle of danger and had found a way through. She also lived quietly in a house that smelled sometimes of curry and sometimes of school books, where Marcus and Tasha left socks on the floor and homework under the table. They watched a mother whose life had been rearranged by a single act of willingness to act. Marcus enrolled in a community college program in engineering. Tasha, who had always hummed before bed, auditioned for music conservatory and won a small scholarship of her own. Angela made them pancakes on Sundays and wrote notes in the margins of her textbooks about binding constants and safety protocols. She kept the jar, the original imported cream, locked in a drawer for a long time, a relic of the night that changed everything. Eventually, she donated it as evidence to a local museum exhibit about medical history, as part of a display that honored everyday people who had reshaped institutional practice. There were days when she still visited wards not to clean but to check a ventilation slot, or read a chart, gestures of a life that had been rewoven into something fuller. She taught new cohorts how to keep simple logs, how to notice and document without fear. Her lectures were always practical. Notice, note, report. She emphasized that humility in institutions is not a weakness but a practice that preserves lives. The moral arc of the hospital changed in ways that were both small and considerable. Policies were amended. An annual listening award was created to honor staff whose observations led to meaningful clinical intervention. The culture evolved, not overnight, not perfectly, but with a steady accumulation of small acts that made it more likely that the person in scrubs carrying a cart would be heard when they felt compelled to say something. And yet, for all the institutional shifts and legal outcomes, the story's moral center always returned to the simple human fact at its core. Someone who felt unseen, noticed the things others had missed, and because she acted, a life was saved. In a quiet epilogue that read more like a collection of ordinary miracles than a single dramatic ending, Angela stood one day in a sunlit classroom, looking out at students who were older and more varied than the typical cohort. They were nurses and custodians and former clerks, each with their own reasons for returning to study. In the front row sat a woman who had once been a floor nurse. In the back, a man who had driven deliveries for the hospital for years. Angela taught them how to translate observation into evidence. She told them the story, sparingly, humbly, about the jar of cream, about the tissue in a maintenance closet, and about the difference a single voice can make when an institution learns to listen. At the far end of the room, a young woman lifted her hand and asked, "What if I say something and they ignore me?" Angela thought of all the moments she'd rehearsed, of Dr. Park's quiet courage, of the manager who later admitted error. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had learned endurance. "Say it clearly," she answered. "Write it down. Bring someone with you if you can, and if you still aren't heard, don't stop. Sometimes a life depends on being stubborn in the right way." When the semester ended, Angela received a letter from Victor's foundation, an offer to fund a rotating scholarship for frontline hospital staff who showed aptitude in sciences. She accepted, not for herself. She had all she needed now, but because the fund lived at the intersection of memory and policy, a way to codify the lesson they had learned. Years later, when she sat at her lab desk and picked up a framed photograph, Marcus in a cap at his college, Tasha with a music stand, and a small plaque from the hospital, Angela thought of the phrase that had begun this story. She remembered the weight of it when Victor first whispered it, the sting of trust placed in a system that could overlook a human voice. But she also remembered the larger lesson, that trust must be paired with listening and that expertise cannot thrive if it is deaf to the kinds of knowledge that walk the corridors without titles. On a quiet morning in a hospital auditorium, Victor stood before a gathering of staff and students. He had been invited not to atone theatrically, but to share a reflection, the vulnerabilities that come with human life and the moral obligation that surrounds care. He spoke without flourish. "I trusted the experts," he said, and his voice carried exactly the remorse and clarity such a confession should have. "And in trusting them, I ignored a voice that tried to save me." He looked out at the audience and his gaze landed on Angela. "I almost paid for that silence with my life," he continued. "But we changed. I changed. The lesson for me is simple. Listen to the person who notices. Listen to the one who cleans the corner, who moves the linens, who watches the small things. Expertise is necessary, but so is humility." The room was quiet enough that the air seemed to hold its breath. For Angela, whose life had been a catalogue of invisible labor and quiet competence, the moment felt like the end of a long, patient sentence. She had not sought vindication. She had sought only to be faithful to the small facts she knew how to read. Now, standing with a life tethered back into its course, she felt a gentle vindication that was not triumphal, but deeply human. She walked home that night under the ordinary lights of the city, the kind of lights that do not flatter but reveal truth. Marcus and Tasha waited for her, their homework spread on the kitchen table like little flags. There was dinner to make and laundry to fold. These tasks were both ordinary and sustaining. Angela put on a kettle, thinking of lab protocols and test strips and the day she'd interrupted a closed meeting because the cost of silence felt too high. She reached for the jar she had kept for a long time as a reminder, not as a relic. It was a small thing, now part of a larger story. At the center of that story was a line that would not let her forget what had set everything in motion. The confession of a man who had been saved and who, in saving, had been humbled. "I trusted the experts and ignored the voice that tried to save me." Angela believed that those words could be a map for institutions and for individuals alike. Trust the expertise that has earned its place, but listen to the person who notices the details. Expertise and listening together, she thought, were the only way to protect lives. If this story of someone overlooked being heard matters to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories where courage comes from the margins and where listening can change a life. Thank you for spending this time with us. When the last of the lights were out in the living room and the house had softened into the hush of night, Angela opened a small drawer where she kept a photograph. It showed a younger version of herself at a campus lab bench, hair tucked back, eyes bright with the possibility of experimentation. Beside that photo, a newer one, a family at a graduation ceremony, all smiles and sleeves thrown back from the work of living. She laid her hand on the older photo and felt the steady press of a life reconfigured. She had been small and unseen. Time had taught her how to convert observation into action without losing the humility that made it possible. She had helped bind an institution to a practice of listening because a man, who had trusted the experts, had finally heard the voice that tried to save him. Outside, the city breathed unremarkable and vast. Inside, the house held the ordinary sounds of dishes being stacked and homework half completed, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had reclaimed a path. The story was not perfectly ended, no human story ever is, but it had bent toward justice and learning, and that to Angela felt like enough for the moment. On a small plaque in the hospital lobby, the inscription read, "In gratitude for the courage to listen." It was short, humble, and true, an emblem of what can happen when expertise meets humility, and when a system learns to value every voice that walks its halls.